she's been my songbird for many years. I want to thank Debbie also for changing with her. They were originally scheduled for different days. Anybody here ever have a bad day? Probably not. Well,
Yes.
our lesson today is from a prophet who had a lot of bad days, Ezekiel. He wasn't a happy camper. I believe the people believed at the time that the good people prospered and the bad people were punished and got zapped. Now, if you think that's a primitive notion, it still kind of lives inside of people. Years ago, when I started as a chaplain at then St. Luke's Hospital, I was sitting with a couple and he had just learned that he had cancer. And he was very down and depressed. And he said something quietly. It was a small room. He was on the bed facing that way, and I was in a chair, and his wife was here. And I didn't hear him because I've had many ears on both ears. It tends to work the hearing down, and I didn't hear what he said, so I asked it to be repeated. And he said, "I wonder what I ever did to deserve this." You know, we're kind of built that way to sometimes think that. But Israel felt that they had been zapped in the exile of 586. They were overrun by the Babylonians. And Ezekiel said, prior to that, your altars shall become desolate, and I will cast down your slain before your idols. Wherever you dwell, your cities will be waste, and your high places ruined. That passage is from the time of the exile. This caused a severe national crisis for Israel. The leaders, the business people were all taken to Babylon, but it created a religious issue that we don't necessarily think or know about, and that is God was regarded as a territorial God residing over Israel. And supposing we change the metaphor a little bit and say, okay, Los Angeles, much bigger than us, came over and took over Phoenix. They wanted to get richer. I don't suppose they need to in California, but they wanted to get richer, okay? What they would do is take the educated people, the university people, the business people, the people with education that could add to their wealth. In such a time, you see, taken away, God could not travel along with them. There was, however, after a despondent period, that's some words of hope from different places. Jeremiah, he said, build houses and live in them, plant vineyards and eat the fruit of them, take wives and beget sons and daughters, take wives also for your sons and give your daughters to husbands that they may bear sons and daughters. So let your numbers increase and not diminish, and seek the welfare of the land to which you have been carried into exile. It's kind of fascinating that even Ezekiel, this prophet of doom, changed his tone from harshness and judgment to tenderness and hope. If you or I had a dream of a vision or vision of a valley of dry bones, it might kind of help us, cause us to recoil a little bit in fear. The question to Ezekiel from God was, can these bones live? You know, I'm glad I wasn't the one that was asked that question, because I might have said, that's a pretty dumb question, isn't it? And you might have too. Ezekiel was more tactful and non-committal. Master God, only you know that. It's a strange scene. But interestingly, the Hebrews often used bones as a metaphor, a symbol of life. They often used the dry bones as a metaphor in life when it went badly. You heard that in the lesson. Having turned 86 10 days ago, I can kind of get into that with more aches and pains and stuff going wrong. In the conversation, God reminds Ezekiel, they say our bones are dried up and our hope is lost. We're cut off completely. And then we hear God tenderly saying, O my people, I will bring you back to the land of Israel. I will put my spirit within you and you shall live. And I will place you on your own soil. Then shall you know that I, the Lord, have spoken and will act. At the same time, there's a passage in Isaiah 40 to 55. He's often called Second or Deutero Isaiah. The verses come out of deep despair, but we hear the prophet articulating the words of God. Have you not known? Have you not heard the Lord God is an everlasting God? You know, we walk a fine line between hope and despair as we go through life. There are rhythms. It's easy to tilt toward despair. I noticed some recent polls said that there's been a drop of about 20% in the people who think our outlook is good as a nation. And I thought, my gosh, how quickly we turn to despair. I recall when I was 10 or 12, my grandmother, Hannah, lovely lady, always tried to feed me too much. Anyway, she said, this was after the war, she said, I feel sorry for the children. Well, that's kind of a bleak outlook, isn't it? I mean, life can't stay as good as it is now, it's going to get worse for them. That's typical of my Norwegian side of my history. If there's a dark side, we probably would find it. Like I said, that's not during the Depression, which they had just gone through. It was after the war when the economy was up and rolling well. The intriguing question comes to each generation, can these bones live? Meaning, can we find hope? Can we find the energy to move forward? We've shown a lot of that in this church, which is wonderful. There's some lessons here. A problem always presents us with a possibility of moving forward. The crisis of Israel caused them to take a step in the evolution of their idea of God, who was no longer just over there, but over everywhere on earth. I don't like the idea that it takes a problem to move forward. As a matter of fact, I really kind of hate it. But I know it's true. It is the way of life. Just an example. You know, my printer somehow decided it wasn't going to scan. And I needed to scan some documents to get some vaccination records from Colorado. Anyway, it gave me a disgusting message. It said, not connected to the internet. And I wanted to say to it, well, how can I print from an iPad and 2 iPhones or 2 computers if it's not connected to the internet? Because it wasn't connected with any kind of line. But I asked the computer something about scanning, and it came up with a nice little app. And it told the computer to scan. And it worked. And it was simpler this way, so I was glad I had the problem in the first place. I'm just a little offended that it listened to the computer, though, and it didn't listen to me. Well, to Desert Garden, the same question comes, can these bones live? The search committee, I'm sure, got tired of me at times because so often I spoke of our need to grow. And they probably were glad when we finally got done. By the way, it was a profound privilege to be on that committee and make that journey, and I came to love and appreciate every one of them. Len recently said we have served two and a half generations of people in this church. And it's on us to add to that number of generations served. You might think it crass to think about numbers, but it's not just a numerical gain that I'm talking about. Our new Pastor Bill knows a lot more now about church growth than I do. You know, he's received over 125 members in his time as in his church. And he's familiar with the literature, which I'm not. And when I went to one of the sessions when he was here, he made a startling statement. He said, a person makes up their mind in 10 minutes whether they want to become involved in that church. Think about that, the first 10 minutes. He said it's not the minister, it's not the music, even if those are all good. So how do we make absolutely sure that everybody feels welcome and warm and embraced? That part's on us. And that will be hard for some, but every person should be greeted. Nobody should walk into our church and we should not walk out of it without taking note of people who are there and greeting them and making them feel welcome. You know, when I was in Rhode Island, this is a long time ago, I thought as a church we should grow, and so I brought it up and talked about it with our deacons. But I realized that at that time anyway, New Englanders were pretty staid in their ways, and they weren't much on reaching out to other people. I ran it by my clergy friends, and they said, you can't possibly grow by 10% in Rhode Island. It's 75% Catholic. Well, I will say we did, and some of them were Catholics who joined. Mm-hmm. But there's a resistance often for change. And I remember one of the deacons saying, well, I kind of hate to just talk to somebody right next to me because maybe they're members and I would be embarrassed. And I thought, we had to get over that resistance. And so Sunday morning we started everybody greeting everybody around them. And we changed the culture. So anyway, that'd be hard for some people maybe to be that outgoing, but I say risk. I can't think of a better reason to be embarrassed than to be embarrassed for Jesus here in this church. We just need to embrace people. Some years back, probably 15 or 20, I don't know, I'm an old guy now. I saw an interview when Southwest Airlines was coming and looking very successful and growing. And the interview was of the president of the company. And he was kind of a chain-smoking guy, I think. But the reporter said, well, what's the secret of your growth? And in a southern drawl, he says, well, at Southwest, we just love everybody. And I thought, you know, if a company like that can create that kind of culture, we indeed can do it here. A third lesson regarding hope and despair. We always have a choice. It's not easy to stay on the side of hope. We've come through a very hard time, and we might be coming in another one. I certainly hope not. But I had a clergy friend some years back who said after some difficult days in our country, he said it's pretty hard to remain optimistic these days. See, it's always easy to fall into despair. The dark side of life has a seductiveness to it that kind of sucks us downward. Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor, spoke about this passage, and he noted the vision doesn't have a date. Most of Ezekiel's had dates, such as, in the year that King Uzziah died, that people knew that. Other passages have a date, but this one does not. And Wiesel comments, Ezekiel's vision of the valley of dry bones bears no dates, because every generation needs to hear in its own time that these bones can live. Each generation, each person has to make that decision for him or herself on the side of hope. It's a choice. It's a choice not to be weighed down by the burdens of life, not to bow to the negative and pessimistic germs of life. Instead to say, I will place my side on the side of hope, and tomorrow I will thank God for today. It's all I have. In this wonderful world of computer cookies, we all get a lot of uninvited things. Right? One that I got on was good quotes, and I look at it once in a while because I like to see what wise people have said and have imparted. In the color purple, there was one. I'm thankful for every day that I've given, both the easy and the hard ones I'm living. That's an attitude. As individuals, as a church, we can say we look forward, if God's granted to us, to happen tomorrow. As a church, we will seize the possibilities God presents to us. Thomas Carlyle said, the one who has hope has everything. Everything. As Len would say, may it be so. Onward.